speaking to traders at the desk, many taking note of the noises that are coming through from the ANC Youth League, more so than they've done in the past. And that with the rhetoric they're saying coming through a little bit more vociferous than it has in the past. Just your sense of what's playing out here?
Well, I mean, obviously it's very bad for the country in terms of the uncertainty that it's creating in the economy generally. And the fact is that, you know, it's not just noise from the Youth League. This is now their policy position. And Julius Malema is saying they're determined to push this issue through. As you know, there's an ANC policy conference next June, followed by the elective conference in December 2012 in Mangaung. And basically what the Youth League is saying, this is our policy position, this is what we're going to push through. And effectively they're also saying to the ANC leadership, unless you support us, we're not going to support you. And we have a situation, I think, in this country at the moment where the leadership of the ANC is quite weak and vulnerable. So, you know, my concern is that this might be used, that the industry might be a sacrificial lamb in the process of the leadership of the ANC being re-elected. And obviously that's not good for the economy in terms of investment, because mining is a long-term, highly capital-intensive industry, and you can't have all this noise surrounding it in what is going to be a very difficult 18 months ahead of us.
Well, while that may be the political landscape, though, I mean, legally, what is the mining sector and investors in that space open to? Is this constitutionally viable?
No, well, what Malema is saying is not constitutionally viable. Basically, he's also saying he recognizes that. I mean, he's a smart operator, and essentially what he's saying is that the mines were stolen from the indigenous people of this country, from black people, and therefore there's no need to pay any compensation. And the corollary of that is that Section 25 of the Constitution, which represents a political compromise going back to Cadessa and the 95-96 constitutional negotiations on the final constitution, he's basically saying that needs to be upended, thrown out the window, that there will be no compensation for the nationalisation of mines, and therefore the Constitution would need to be amended. Now, the Bill of Rights requires a two-thirds majority to amend it. The fundamental provisions of the Constitution actually require 75% majority to amend it. He recognises that, and so he says, well, we have to get those majorities in the next election in 2014 in order to do that. So obviously, I mean, he recognises there are constitutional impediments to this. This is not going to be easy from a political perspective, but my concern is not just the legal side of it, it's just what it's doing to the whole investment climate in the country, which I think is threatened by this, quite
You
frankly.
mentioned earlier that you know, the mining sector may be put forward as a sacrificial lamb moving forward, and that is your fear. We've even had argument highlighting that possibly with the ANC Youth League, you know, calling for the old guard to move on, we may well see a split in the ANC, so the old guard moving away from the Youth League and two opposition parties emerging. Do you see that going that far?
I must say, I've heard the Democratic Alliance say, Helen Zille saying much the same thing. I actually think that's wishful thinking. I think the ANC is going to stay together as long as it can, because it realizes, it is a broad church alliance. I think it realizes as an organisation that, you know, once parts of it start splitting off, then the sum of the parts becomes much weaker once those factions disappear. So I think it's much more likely that the ANC will stay together, but with all this policy incoherence and a weak leadership. But that's obviously not good for the country, because you know, what you have is a situation where the ANC leadership is saying, well, nationalisation is not the policy of this government. And the Minister of Mineral Resources, Susan Shabangu, said the same thing consistently, to her credit. The President said the same, Zuma said the same thing. But the problem is Youth League is saying exactly the opposite, and they're saying, well, if the leadership get in the way of this, we'll basically get rid of the leadership.
Of course, you know, this call for nationalisation is predicated on the Freedom Charter's vision that the people shall share in the country's wealth. I mean, has it worked in the past? Because that's the question we really need to be asking. Have there been working examples that justifies a move like this?
I cannot think of a single example, but you can't really have this debate rationally, because I'm not sure there's much rational thought going into it, to be quite frank. But, you know, one issue is this, that people often forget this. The mineral resources in this country were nationalised with the Mineral Petroleum Resources Development Act coming into force in 2004. Mineral resources were put under state ownership. It's called custodianship in the Act, but it's a form of public trust for our mineral resources. So, you know, you could, people in the ANC do argue this, and I think correctly, that in fact that goal of the Freedom Charter has been achieved. What Malema and company are referring to, though, is the failure of black economic empowerment. And I think that is an issue in this country, and I think from that perspective he does have a point, that empowerment has, in a sense, and he's looking at it slightly differently, has, you know, just made a few people rich. It's promoted crony capitalism. There's not been the benefit of empowerment for the broad mass of people in this country.
So where nationalisation, you know, doesn't really advocate, you know, rational, or, you know, or people find it hard to believe into that, you know, where you've got 100% ownership of mineral wealth by the people. What about options of 51% or more public ownership, or joint venture, you know, partnership through partnership arrangements between government and the private sector? Should we be exploring those options, or should we just be clarifying and implementing existing laws?
Well, you know, I think we should be doing more the latter than the former. The Youth League refer to the 51% partnership, the 50-50 partnership, in fact, with De Beers and Botswana. I always say to people that is a different model, because that was a greenfields industry where that 50-50 agreement was from the beginning, from the discovery of diamonds in the 1960s. So, you know, I think but I do think we need to look at the whole issue of how empowerment is working in this country, how it's being played out. The other thing I would say, just as a sort of final comment, is that, you know, one of the things one could look at is the privatization on the sort of Russian-Polish model in Eastern Europe of state resources and giving away shares to the majority of the people in this country. That's an issue that hasn't been looked at.